My subject today is the 8 children of Bernhard and Emma Kahn, who were born in the 50s and 60s of the 19th century. 8 children. I will now rattle them off. Franz, Clara, Otto H., Lily, Paul, Felix, and Hedwig. Hedy. I hope you didn't count. I think that was 8. Anyhow, if I missed one, never mind. I will start with Kahn number 1, Franz Kahn, who became an academic lawyer, or rather he never practiced law, but apparently he was a brilliant original thinker in the law, in legal theory, jurisprudence. And he would have made a very great career had he not become ill of lung disease. And but at first it was tolerable, and he lived until he was 43. And he had quite an interesting career, but the disease prevented him from becoming a great celebrity. However, he wrote a lot, and I was told that it was characterized by great originality and depth, and some of it is still being used. And his field was private international law. And he had a great library, and that library formed the nucleus of a law library which is used in one of the institutes in Kiel. And he became a great expert in Goethe, that was very common in the 19th century, especially in Jewish families. Almost all the biographers of Goethe were Jews. And he was also remarkable because he was a world traveler, even though he was ill. But he still traveled to India, including Ceylon, Sri Lanka. He went to Japan. He became interested in Buddhism. And he was apparently a very nice man. And it was a great tragedy when he died, because he was sensible and he had an even-tempered, and he was a bridge, as the oldest of the Kahn sons, between some of the more difficult siblings and the parents, especially the mother, Emma, who was a very domineering mother, who worked very hard to find the right professions and marriages for her 8 children. That was Franz the jurist. We can now come to the oldest daughter, Clara, who was very erudite too, a little sentimental, and who had the same inherited the interest for the theater of the Kahn families. And it was also always the modern things, the progressive things, the daring things. And she became a great admirer of the playwrights, the new Ibsen, and the German Ibsen, Gerhard Hauptmann. I suppose very few of you have heard of him, but in his day, and also even in my day, he was a major figure, the German equivalent of Ibsen, interested in social problems and naturalistic. That was all pre-expressionist, it was all naturalism on the stage. Great conflict, very dramatic. And Hauptmann, who is a was a personal friend of a number of the Kahns. Hauptmann was a very daring in his youth, very daring playwright, and only the most progressive-minded liberal people were interested in him. And Clara went to Berlin. She was the first of the Kahns who went to Berlin, the nation's capital, the capital of Prussia. There was no Germany yet. From Baden to Prussia, and in Prussia, in Berlin, there was a very large market for modern and avant-garde art, as there is now. And there was a theater group that had been formed by a man called Otto Brahm, like Brahms without the S at the end, Otto Brahm. It's very well known in German theater history. And he was the director of the free stage, Freie Bühne. And Clara, who by then was remarried at 21, she married a lawyer called Jonas. Mr. Jonas, I've forgotten his first name. Jonas. She was married and had children. And Clara fell in love with Otto Brahm, the head of the Freie Bühne, of the Free State. And it was a most passionate, deep affair. And she wanted to leave her husband Jonas and leave her 3 children and marry Mr. Brahm. And the family, Emma, the mother, the siblings were just aghast at the prospect of this. That is something that was beyond. They might have been very liberal and progressive in their tastes, but in family matters, no nonsense. They did not, and anyhow they stopped it. But she never got over it. And Mr. Brahm died, and she spent another year or two publishing some of these papers posthumously, and then she died. A very tragic life. That was Clara. And we now come to a much more interesting life, and that is Robert Kahn, the composer. Robert Kahn was born around 65, I think, 1865, and became a composer. He is now being performed again. He was completely forgotten, but he was a German composer, mainly of chamber music. And his talent was discovered very, very early, and they gave him every chance, the best musical education they could. And I think, before he made his Abitur, which is the final exam, the matric, he went to Berlin to study at the Hochschule für Musik, the conservatory. And then when he was in his early 20s, he met Brahms, the Brahms with the S at the end. He met Brahms, and he moved to Vienna to be near Brahms. And for 3 months he saw Brahms every day. And Brahms wanted him to become a student, a proper student, and Robert Kahn declined. The record says out of diffidence. He thought he was not worthy of Brahms. But I think there must be other reasons, which I don't know. I tried to look up, I have a Brahms biography, I couldn't find anything. However, something has been written about this, which I haven't got. But there must have been. Anyhow, the connection with Brahms was very useful to him. He went back to Berlin, and I have heard some of his, in fact I have a CD of some of his recordings, and they sound like Brahms. His recording, his style was very Brahmsian. And from 1903 to 1933, the Nazis came in. He was a professor at the Hochschule, at the conservatory in Berlin. So he spent his life as an academic teacher and composer. And some of his students were very well known artists. Rubinstein. Rubinstein was a student of his, and there were all kinds of others. And other famous people performed his music. The music was totally forgotten until a few years ago, and it's being performed again. I come back to Robert Kahn in a minute or so. I should mention, I have not really mentioned this, and that's very important, that there was a division in the Kahn family between those two brothers. There was the Bernhard Kahn, they stayed in Mannheim, and Hermann, who went to Frankfurt to form the bank in Frankfurt, who was my great-grandfather, and they were the Frankfurt Kahns. There was the Mannheim Kahns and the Frankfurt Kahns, and there was very little connection between them, and I cannot understand why. So I never met any of the Bernhard Kahn family, and I think my mother also had only very casual. I think she met one of the Kahns once or twice, but had no real relation to it. And Emil too. Only we did not have any personal contact with the Bernhard Kahn, with the Mannheim Kahn family. And there must be a reason, but I don't know what the reason is. It seems to be kind of uncharacteristic. However, okay, that's Robert Kahn. Now, there will be three other Kahns, and I will not now talk about them. There's Otto H. Kahn, Otto the Magnificent, and there is Lily Deutsch, Lily, and then there's Paul Kahn. And I'm going to have a talk about each one of them separately. And there are two little Kahns left. And they are Felix Kahn, who was a violinist, and who followed Otto H. to the United States. Otto H., subject very soon, Otto H. became Otto the Magnificent, became a great, huge figure in the United States, and Felix, the violinist, followed him, and very little is known of him, and one assumes that Otto H. financed him. But I know nothing about him, and the sources which I consulted have nothing to say about him. And then there was Hedy, the youngest, and she was considered a Sorgenkind, the child of sorrows. However, she was very pretty, and she was considered shallow and a little frivolous. And she was not particularly. The most amusing, the wittiest of the Kahn children seems to have been the composer Robert. Hedy, who was pretty and flirtatious, was not particularly amusing, apparently, and certainly had a very difficult life, because she married twice. She married Mr. Meyer. That was considered a good marriage. The mother, I think, probably arranged it, and it said Mr. Meyer had good prospects, financial prospects. However, it didn't work out. I think, yes, he cheated on her, and she didn't like that. So that marriage ended in divorce. And then she married again, and a Swiss financier, whatever you call it, a Swiss money man called Raymond Pollack. And they went to England in 1907, and in England they proceeded he, Mr. Pollack, proceeded to go bankrupt. And the Kahns were not pleased by that and had to rescue him financially twice. However, the marriage apparently lasted. The interesting thing about them is that they had a daughter, and it could be that she was adopted, whose name was Ellen Pollack, and who became an actress, and she acted in the early Bernhard Shaw plays, and she acted in movies. And I looked her up, and I found that she only died at the age of 94 or something, in 1998 or something. So we could all have met. If we had known about her, we could have met her. I didn't know anything about her. And no, it was terrible to have a divided family like that, because I went to school in England between the years of 1935 and 1937, Cranbrook School, Kent. And Robert Kahn, the composer, who in 1933, when the Nazis came in, was already over 65. He was retired. So he thought nothing terrible could happen to him. He was retired anyway. In 1934, he was expelled from the academy, from the Prussian Academy of the Arts. Didn't like that. But he thought, well, what can they do to me? And he went to his country house in Mecklenburg, north of Berlin, and thought he would compose. And he stayed there, 1937, 1938, Crystal Night, November 1938, the Crystal Night. He survived that, but he then went to England. And in various letters which have survived, he was amazed that in those final years of his, he was very productive. The ideas and melodies came to him with great ease, and he had a final period of compositions in his final years. He went to England after the early 1939, and where did he go? And I don't know why. He went to Biddenden, Kent, a village next to Cranbrook, where I went to school. If I had known Robert, Uncle Robert, it would have been so great for me to meet the old man. And he might even have been interested in me. I was playing the violin. I could have played some of his sonatas. But I didn't know a thing about him. And so he died, but I'm still around.